Just going to be real honest with you. I thought I was back to teaching a couple weeks before school started. It was time to start. In fact, Don and I looked at each other and realized it was 2 or 3 after 6. And I noticed I got about 4 students back here all on your phone. I thought that looks about like a school setting right back here. So we were back into it just a little bit. Everybody trying to figure it all out. But glad to have you here with us this evening. And we'll be talking this evening about Jesus's 5th and 6th appearances. That'll be our topic, as it were, for this evening. We've spent the last couple of services that we've discussed this. We talked about Jesus' resurrection. We talked about how that Jesus makes multiple appearances. We also sort of stressed that that's not individual, but sort of in different settings, in different places and times, I guess you would say. So tonight we'll talk about the 5th and the 6th. So just as a bit of a review over the things that we've been discussing here in the last couple of weeks, we'll talk about that and then we'll go a little bit further. But the reason that we would talk about this is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. It's the foundation of Christianity. If Jesus were not resurrected, then Jesus's death would have been the same as anybody else's. People died of old age and people died of crucifixion for crimes committed and every other kind of way of death, and there would have been no difference in the death of Jesus as well. We've talked about already, but we talked about the empty tomb early on the first day of the week. Even though it had been sealed, we talked about how that the arrangement of grave clothes indicated that the body had not been stolen, but rather it was a rather peaceful remove. And then we saw how Jesus made appearances following his resurrection to women, to disciples, to others. We talked about last week, I think it was last week, the 2 men on the road to Emmaus. And we talked about that. And all of this would come from things that had been talked about in the Old Testament as well. Paul, we read this last week, also describes the resurrection in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. So a handful of different things there, not that you don't already know, we've already talked about, but just to review just a bit. Tonight we'll be talking about the 5th and the 6th appearances for Jesus. We are going to, as we've been on pretty much all of this, been in the very end of the Gospels. We'll be in Luke chapter 24 and John chapter 20 tonight. We'll also, no, that's probably it. Luke chapter 24 and John chapter 20. I thought we might have jumped into Mark. I had a note, but I don't think we actually get there this evening. But just a little bit of a prep for it. In the evening of the first day of the week following Jesus' crucifixion, the disciples are gathered in Jerusalem behind closed doors or behind shut doors. I want us to think for just a second, not necessarily scripturally, but I want us to think about this post-Jesus world for Jesus's disciples. And when I say post-Jesus, let's talk about the fact that Jesus has died. Forget the resurrection and all of that. But imagine you've spent the last 3 years following Jesus. You've spent the last 3 years hearing Jesus speak and teach and all of that. You maybe didn't quite understand it. It seems pretty clear in the Bible that they quite often didn't really understand what he was saying. But I want you to consider what it would be like when Jesus died. What would be some concerns? What would be some fears? What would be whatever word you want to use there for somebody who was a follower of Christ at that time? Could be the end. What do you mean by the end? Okay. So it's almost like getting fired from the job. That's the last. Okay. What else? Well, what's the next step? Even if your faith in Jesus was strong, even if you are anticipating resurrection, maybe still, what do we do, Ben? All right. They saw what happened to him, and we're the people that are closest to him. There could be a similar thing. Josh? Ben took yours, Mary? Say it again. No, what did you say? Okay. So what Mary says, maybe we've been tricked by this. Maybe this was a sort of a scam or an imposture, and I've spent 3 years, and the guy died just like anybody else would have. All of those things would seem to be maybe on the minds of the people as they gather, as they'll gather behind closed doors here, as we say. What we're going to see is they're relating events of the day, and Jesus appears to them. He demonstrates his identity to the disciples by showing them the marks of his suffering, and then he proves his bodily resurrection by eating. For this one, this fifth appearance that we're going to talk about first tonight, Thomas is not there, and that will play a vital role in the story as well. So we can kind of split tonight into pre-Thomas and post-Thomas, our two lessons. And you probably know the story of Thomas, and we'll see about that here as we go. So let's start. This is Luke chapter 24, and we're going to read verses 36 through 39 right here. Tom, do you care to read this one for us, sir? Okay. We'll go a little bit further. This is 40 to 43. Will, do you care to read those? All right. So we're going to look at each of that here in just a second. I got several questions here that I want us to look at. So when Jesus appears to his disciples, this is in the book of Luke. If we're in Luke chapter 24, this is right after the story that we talked about last week that Don read at the start of class, which was the road to Emmaus. And so Jesus had appeared to those men. They kind of realized it, but they realized that he was already gone before they sort of recognized it. And so I don't know what the time frame is here, but now he appears to his disciples. What does he first say to them in verse 36? Peace be unto you, peace be to you, peace be with you, whatever translation there would it be. What is that saying? Uh-huh.
It's so much beyond what, calmness or whatever.
Right.
There's a lot more meant to it.
So Ben went way deeper than I thought. It was just kind of a greeting, right? that it was. But he's right though. That was maybe not necessarily that was not just a hey, what's up kind of a greeting, but nonetheless sort of a greeting that maybe somebody that you were closely intertwined with that you maybe share. Is that a fair thing to say, Mary? Where did you? Yeah. Sure. Okay. So I do think, though, that if Jesus has been crucified, has been buried, and has now been resurrected, it might have took more than peace be with you for me to understood what this would have meant. And I can see how that would have, you would have needed some calming words to have heard that. Let's go a little bit further. Luke 24 and 37 says the disciples were terrified and frightened. And it states that they thought they had seen a what? Okay? So think about this for a second. It says they were terrified and they were frightened and they thought they had seen a what? They thought they had seen a spirit. How would we describe this probably? Well, we might use the word ghost right there. The kind of thing you're not expected to see, right? The kind of thing that you certainly weren't expecting. Yes, sir. I don't know if it's the exact same word, but I think the thought, I definitely think what we're seeing here or what we're hearing described is you're seeing something you weren't expecting to see. You've heard people say, if I'd rounded the corner, if I'd seen, I would have, that's the last thing I thought. Well, it's the same kind of thing there for these people. Now, I want us to look at this question right here. Should they have felt this way?
I think so, because God just materializing your praise while you're talking about it. It's not something that you're accustomed to or even heard of happening.
Right. Definitely a human side. And no matter how many times it seems like we saw Jesus sort of go over I don't want to use the word game plan, but maybe that's what it would be. What was going to happen? It still doesn't seem like what you would have expected to happen. And so that's not a fair question really to ask, because it's easy for us to look back and say, they should have known that was going to be him. But like you said, Mom, sort of that human side of us makes that really difficult. Yeah, go ahead. Sure. Mm-hmm. So, are there earlier scriptures which described Jesus as in a resurrected human form? Yeah. We've been talking about this, right? There's people that have already seen Jesus who came to the disciples and said, we've seen Jesus. The women, and what did they do? They sort of laughed at him, and you're crazy. No, you hadn't. So it's almost like this, what they are seeing, they should have already known, because there were people that had seen it. And so it's easy again to sort of, in hindsight, look back and say what people should or shouldn't have known. And we can fall victim to that. But this is something that, had they paid attention earlier, it might have been more recognizable later. To demonstrate to disciples that his body had been resurrected, what did Jesus tell them to do to him? What did Jesus tell them? That's terrible grammar. That's unbelievable. I'm kind of embarrassed to do that. But he says, what did he tell them to do to him? To check the places in his hands and his feet, right? Yes, ma'am. Right. So he tells her that, but they were still at the tomb. And he said that he had not yet resurrected. I don't really know the answer to that question. Ben, you may be able to answer that just a little bit better yourself.
I think from reading the words and everything from that, he tells her to stop clinging to me. Not touch me.
Right.
Stop clinging to me. I've got work I need you to go do.
Okay.
So not that she wasn't allowed to touch you, but I need you to stop.
So I'm thinking about you walking out this door, me holding onto your legs and you're dragging me along. And the language there, that could certainly be the same. But he allows them to touch him to show this. What would be the reason for it? To ease their mind. What else? So they know he's real. What else? The Christian world has spent 2,000 years sort of making fun of Thomas, when the reality is the first time Jesus appears to the apostles, he tells them to touch, right? And we've been critical of Thomas for 2,000 years, when the reality seems like that the other apostles kind of needed to have that extra touch there as well. He explained that a spirit doesn't have what, which he clearly did in 38 and 39. It doesn't have flesh and bones. You've seen scary movies, right, where there's a ghost and it just sort of appears and and it's like it goes through the wall or whatever. He says, well, I have flesh and bones. If me or you try to walk through that wall tonight, it's not going to work out real good, right? So he says, I am clearly here in human form. Now, after showing his hands and feet, the disciples believed him. Let's look at verses 40 through 43 right there. Sure.
The guy asked him to spend the night with the
Uh-huh.
and he ate with those people. I think that he did resurrect the Father and he came back. Don't ask me how, when, or what the exact moment. I think Jesus rose from the tomb. He rose, went to his Father, ascended to his Father. I think his Father gave him a pat on the back, in my words. He came back to the Son. Just like he was. That's what I've always believed. I may be wrong. But I always believe.
Is there a scriptural reference?
Well, I just think because he was a physical being. But I think when he told Mary, I don't agree with Ben. I think, I'm not touching him. But I think he said, I've not yet ascended to my Father. Don't touch me. That's very telling to me. I'm going to ascend to my Father here real soon. That was very early in the morning. That evening, he was back with the guys walking on the road and eating. And now he's here with these guys.
Well, look at
Maybe the next day.
Look at two elders disagreeing and getting off. Tell you what, lesson went well this morning. It did exactly what we were supposed to do right there. That's good. Okay. So, and let me say this too. I think it's really hard to teach the resurrection. It's not hard to teach crucifixion. Because people died. I think it's hard to teach this because there's no frame of reference to it. Who walked with God? Enoch, right? I mean, that's sort of like a vague Old Testament story that, what have you. This is really difficult because it's hard for us to put any kind of personal experience with this. And so it's also complicated by the fact that every time that we've studied in this over the last few weeks, I said, well, let's go to Luke, let's go to Mark, let's go to John. We don't have a clear, one singular, tell me everything I need to know in one setting book as well, which complicates things a little bit as well. So let's look at verses 40 through 43. After showing his hands and feet, do the disciples believe in him? They still didn't believe, right? They still didn't believe. And so Jesus has a follow-up. What further requests does he make to prove himself resurrected? He says, have you any food here, right? And they say yes, or they at least give him something. Verse 42, what do they give him to eat? All right. Broiled fish and a honeycomb, all right? So let's think about those two things for a second. This is not scriptural, but I want us to think about it for a second. What would broiled fish require? To eat. It's not a liquid, right? Your hands, all right? So you're teeth, you're gonna have to bite into it. But a honeycomb, a piece of fish and a piece of honeycomb are two very different textures, right? It's not like drinking a liquid, or it's not like drinking, it's eating something very soft. The fish would be pretty soft. The honeycomb would be pretty hard, in my opinion. You're going to have to chomp through this. And so this experience of eating, this visible experience of somebody eating, is going to look about like me or you eating fish and honeycomb, chomping, and it's going to look pretty real. Go ahead.
I think it's hard to believe with all the things that Jesus did when he's on the earth, that this is going to happen to him.
Right.
He raised the dead, he done everything, And it's hard to believe that what he was telling was going to happen.
Sure. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
I think he's right in what he said. These people had been hit with everything they didn't understand. They had been following Jesus, they believed him, but now they're living, and it's happening. And I think, honestly, they didn't know what to expect.
Sure.
Because they were human. So trying to say, it's okay. I understand, see, I'm eating. And he's really trying to relate and bring them to the next thing.
Think, smash both of those two answers together, it works really well. It seemed to them, after all that Jesus had done, that this shouldn't have happened. And so, like Dee said, he's sort of doing real life, real human things to make it maybe more relatable. Go ahead.
Islam, that's their reason for believing that Jesus was the Son of God, because their whole teaching is, well, God never would allow this to happen.
Right.
So it couldn't have been the Son.
which is an extremely realistic viewpoint for a human being to make, because I wouldn't allow that to happen to my son. And so I can understand that completely. Let's jump. Well, we're not jumping. We're staying in the same place. Let's go a little bit further. So this is Luke, bless you, Luke 24, verses 44 and 45. Annette, do you care to read these for us, please? Let's go a little bit further here. Then this is all right. Now, Jesus, when he speaks to these disciples, when he use this word right here, once they've sort of been made clear who he was, then he immediately starts to prepare them for their next task. What will be the next task of Jesus' apostles? To go out and preach and teach, right? To go out and share the gospel, the Great Commission, as it were. And so he tells them, he commissions them to do what in his name to all nations? Verse 46 and 47. So let's look at verse 46. It says, thus it is written, and thus it was necessary for Christ to what? To suffer. Did he do that? Okay. And then he says, and to what? To rise from the dead on the third day. And so they've witnessed both of those things, right? That they've done both of those things. Verse 47, and that repentance and remission of sins should be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. So if we look at verse 46 and 47, there's a clear divide, right? What was verse 46? All the things that what? Have already taken place. What's verse 47? All the things that have not taken place. But they are the ones that have to go do it. He says you're going to preach in his name, right? So it's not going to be him that does it. This is the first time that the apostles are going to have to go out on their own, right? You know, he's talked about when I'm gone, you'll have to do this. We've looked at those verses, but this is him saying, I am, let's just go ahead and say it, I am gone now. Your job is to go out and preach and teach. And the important point is they had to get all of these sort of human concerns out of the way. Was Jesus real? Could he eat? They had to get all of that out before they could go and teach. Oops. Is that it? Oh, all right. Thoughts on that? That's the Great Commission, as it were, for them. Let's go a little further. This is John chapter 20. Verses 21 through 25. John chapter 20, verses 21 through 25. Boo, do you care to read this? At this gathering, what they had seen, how does he reply? Verse 24 and verse 25 there. Didn't believe him. What is it, Mel? Got to see it, Lucille? He says exactly in verse 25, unless I see in his hands the print of the nails and put my finger into the print of the nails and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. And so he's saying here that he wants to put his hand, he wants to touch where the nail went in. Why does he say into the side? That's the Spirit went. So Thomas was clearly aware of what kind of punishment Jesus had received. Thomas is not blank to all of this, but he's aware of the punishment, the type of crucifixion that Jesus had received. But he said, I need to see it. Now, the others had already seen. He said they just described it with verse 25. They said, we have seen the Lord, right? But he needed to see just a bit more from that as well. So why do you think Thomas was reluctant to accept what his friends were saying? So it's kind of just going down the line, right? And the next person and the next person, and so on. Mary. Right. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So now we're going to look at Jesus' sixth appearance. And we kind of saved Thomas for afterwards. I got a picture here. I don't know what the picture is. I mean, I know what it is, but I don't know what the date is. It's pretty old though. But Jesus appears to his disciples 1 week later, giving Thomas the same opportunity to view his wounds and to handle them. For Thomas, there's no longer any doubt about the future, and we'll see how Thomas responds to that here in just a second. So the opportunity is here for him. Again, we're going to start this. I say a week later, it says 8 days, I think is what it says. But the point of this is being that Jesus is around, right? Jesus is sort of present, as it were. This is John 20, verses 26 to 29. Ben, do you care to read this?
And after 8 days, the disciples were again inside. And Thomas with them. Jesus came, the door being shut, and stood in the midst and said, peace to you. Then he said to Thomas, reach your finger here and look at my hand, and reach your hand here and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believe. And Thomas answered and said to him, my Lord and my God. Jesus said to him, Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed.
We'll look at all three of these verses, all four of these verses here sort of individually as we go. But Jesus first tells Thomas, so a little time has passed. They've told Thomas, we saw the Lord. He's like, maybe not. I got to see it to believe it, kind of a thing. And so Jesus tells Thomas to not be what, but be what instead. It's a worded weird, but he says, don't be what? Don't be unbelieving, but instead be what? Be believing. So he is clearly aware of the fact that Thomas didn't believe what, as Josh, you said a minute ago, as the women had said, and then as the other disciples later had said as well. He says, don't be unbelieving, but be believing. Now, how many of you have ever had somebody say to you, believe me or trust me? Have you always believed and trusted them every time they said it? No, even people today were a little reluctant. It's like, well, because when Ben says, trust me on this, I'm thinking about everything Ben's ever told me. I'm weighing it, right? Well, I didn't trust him on this one. Or, we're kind of, he says, but don't be unbelieving, but be believing. What does that mean? And why is that hard?
Believing completely is one of the most difficult things I think there is. The man who sinned, or his son was sick, and Jesus said, if you believe, he said, Lord, I believe, help me with my unbelief.
Yeah.
We all believe. We wouldn't be here all.
Sure.
But there are doubts, there are fears, there are worries, there are worldly thoughts that try to keep in our mind. That's always been one of my things I pray every day, Lord. Help me with my blood. Help me to overcome these things. I think it's just human nature. And I think, we all struggle with that at some point.
Yeah. Other thoughts on it? I think why, and this is what I was kind of getting at, but what Ben's saying is our struggle with that is that we're told so many times by so many people to believe and they let us down, right? So it's human nature that you're going to be let down by your coworkers or your friends or even by your family. And so that makes it difficult, to be able to believe that even for us today. Yeah, right. Pounced at the time, right? Exactly right. Go ahead. I don't know. I'm not real sure, but hold on to that because I want to look at the last verse a little bit to connect that as well. In what way then does Thomas confess his faith in his belief? What happens in verse 28? So in just 3 or 4 words right there, he confesses his belief there, right? Well, did Thomas not believe Jesus the 3 years that they were together?
I believe that with him confessing my Lord and my God.
Right.
I believe that Thomas 1,000% believed that Jesus was something special.
Right.
He was a prophet. He was doing these miracles. He done them himself.
Yeah.
Put hands in them. And I think he just couldn't grasp the concept. But here, I think he probably does it. He puts my Lord and my God.
Right.
1,000% you are God.
I think Lord in the way we use the word Lord is different in some ways, but Lord is someone who sort of ranks above you, for lack of a better word. There's the Lord of the manor, as it were. And I think without a doubt, what Ben's saying here is correct, that Thomas viewed Jesus as his leader, as it were. He was an apostle to Jesus. But we see that the my God part, I think, then, this is what made him truly believe that this was the Son of God. Mary, go ahead. Shown what? I think they're still in a group here. Thomas wasn't just alone. He was with a group in this setting as well. So I want us to think about that second question today. What role does confession play in our lives today? A necessity. How come? Uh-huh. Okay. So I became a Christian in November of 1995 and confessed. Do I ever have to confess again? Yeah.
Words have power. Okay. Words have meaning, and not only in their own psychologically, but spiritually as well. And when same way, if you always talk in negativity, always breathe negativity, I can't do this, I can't do that, that affects you. And I think confession of faith does the same way. When you talk about it, like those ones on the Mason, did not our hearts burn within us when we walk? When you talk, when you confess your faith, when you talk to others about your faith, it builds yours up and builds theirs up, and it just fans and fans and fans.
In the sort of overarching Christian religious world, the concept of confession usually goes along with admitting things that you've done wrong. I think in many ways, confession has sort of a negative connotation, not in a bad way, but just because I've done this wrong, I need to get that out. But that shouldn't be our only form of confession, right? I mean, if we've sinned, if I've hurt you, if I've treated you poorly, I need to confess. I need to apologize to you. I need to confess the wrong that I've done. But there needs to be some Thomas moments for us as well, where we make the same statement that he says in John chapter 20 and verse 28 right here, my Lord and my God. It shouldn't just be well, I thought about it once, but it should be a steady, ongoing type of thing. Now, this is where we'll get to what Don was asking there just a second ago. What response does Jesus then give to Thomas whenever Thomas says, "My Lord and my God"?
Blessed are you because you've seen these things and believe. More blessed will be those who have not seen these things and still believe.
It's a great question, Don. In fact, if you look up there, you'll see, was this a rebuke, right? It's almost word for word. I thought, we'll wait on that. Is this a rebuke? Okay. Right. You're talking about when she was doing all the work and other and Now you posed the question. Do you want to go first, or you want him to go first? She's been waiting all day to say that, Don.
I've heard people say it was a rebuke. I personally don't think it is because even today, people are different. It takes different things for them to believe. It's the gospel. I'm saying that. They get them to that point.
Sure. D.
I don't think it's that different from the 11. Had Thomas been there, the 11 had questions. Now, did they not believe? Again, I go back and say, this was almost so new to them. And I go back to John 5, and we're told to search the scriptures. I think that's exactly what they were doing at that time. They were exploring and not just accepting, blindly being told this. And I think the same thing applies to Thomas. Yes, they were disciples telling him, but he hadn't seen it. They had.
Right.
And if he'd been there, he probably would have accepted just like they did.
So I saw Mary first, Josh. Mary.
What he said is what I was trying to get to about the really great question. So the 24 says Thomas was not with the group and came to the group after. And so I think what we're seeing is the interaction between him and the one. We don't have that before. We don't know that this interaction didn't happen with others. It's just a one in our common.
Right.
And I agree. I don't think it's a rebuke. If anything, it's a teaching moment because there's going to be a lot of people that interact with that did not see them. There's only a finite amount of people that did see them, and they were supposed to go out and teach and expect people to believe and follow.
So hold on to that for a second. Josh, go ahead.
Like what Dee said there, they were supposed to search and not blindly be led. That's the same as us. When you get up preach or anybody here, we can take what you say and we compare it to the Bible to make sure what you're saying is true. So that's our way of questioning to see if it's true.
So the back half of the third bullet point up here is what I wanted, and that's what Mary and Josh, and you're kind of all getting at. By default, why is Thomas a pivotal Bible character for Christians in our time? When I say default, like it sort of just has to happen. Why is Thomas a pivotal character for Christians today? Sure. Because why?
Jesus always met people where their beliefs were. The different ways he healed people, spitting in mud, doing this. He met them where their need was. And he does us that way too.
Sure.
We all don't just come in here believing. We all have different things, different life experiences that have led us here to lead us to a believing faith. And we can't beat ourselves up on that because just like Thomas, I may be something that you're getting it
Right.
But God doesn't like it.
What does verse 29 say? He said, Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed, right? But there's a period, and then there's a second part, a second sentence. He says, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed, right? Thomas, as Mary said just a moment ago, he was kind of fortunate to live in a time period where Jesus would be physically present for him. They could shake hands, as it were, or poke, into the holes in his skin, whatever it might be. Can we experience that? No, we can't experience that. And so our belief was always going to have to be based on faith, right? It's the same thing that every single person, that every apostle went. We see the apostles go all over the place, here and there and everywhere. And I would imagine, I don't think I'm guessing, I think this would be, that there were a lot of people who asked the apostles, can you make this guy come back? Can we see him? Can we, I think it's realistic to think that people would have thought, why did you get to see him, but we didn't get to see him? Well, that's that building of faith. That's what Ben was saying here just a moment ago. And sometimes we'll jump headfirst into it. I got it. I'm 100% in agreement, but sometimes we're not. Sometimes we do need a little poking and prodding, as it were. Other thoughts on Thomas? Right. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Sure. Right. There have been times when I have finished speaking and I've thought that was the best I have ever done. And I could tell you people that I'm pretty sure were asleep. And there have been times when I've thought, I just made it through it. It wasn't very good. I didn't feel like I did good at all. And people come up and say, boy, that was great. I really got a lot from it. You just don't really know how things are going to work. You don't know how things are going to click. And a lot of times you're exactly right. What works for one, if it worked the same for everybody, it'd be a lot easier, but that's not how it works. Let's finish up with just a couple of things here. In John chapter 1 and verse 1, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In 1 John chapter 1, verses 1 to 3, it's what Jimmy read a second ago, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled concerning the word of life. The life was manifested, and we have seen and bear witness and declare to you that eternal life, which was with the Father and was manifested to us. That which we have seen and heard, we declare to you, that you also may have fellowship with us. And truly, our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. What's different and what's the same about these opening sentences of these two different books? Right. Right.
We saw it, we handled it, we ate it, we slept with it, we handled it.
The Gospel of John on the left-hand side up here is sort of it's the beginning, right? So it's the first, and we're kind of learning, and this is the retirement speech at the end almost, that they've experienced everything right there. And so the Gospel of John begins by declaring who Jesus was, that Jesus was God. He was with God. It was from God. And the same thing comes at you at the beginning of 1 John. It's confirmed one more time at the end of his gospel with Thomas declaring the same thing. And what we see here is that over time, our experience grows. Is that the right word? We experience more. We're more confident in what we've experienced. We're more confident in our faith, maybe as it were, as well. Right. Right.
I think that's the majesty of the Holy Spirit that Jesus said, I'll send the comfort to you, so you may know. And he did send the comfort to us, and the comfort came, the Bible was recorded, and we 2,000 years later, and we can know with all assurance, people have gone to crosses and been put to death in the most painful way because of their belief, and they're not going away from it.
Let's finish here. This is John chapter 20, the last two verses, 30 and 31. And we'll look at John 21 probably more next week. But we read here, and truly Jesus did many other signs, and in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe in Jesus, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. What's not written in this book? Verse 30. Everything Jesus did. Now, would it be possible to write everything Jesus did? What? Not carry. That's yeah. It would be. It's possible to write everything everybody's ever done if you knew it, right? But Ben said and not be able to carry it. So why did he write the things that he did? Okay. So the 31st, verse 31, they are written that you may believe that Jesus is who? That Jesus is the Christ, Christ being what? Messiah, right? That's what the word means. The Son of God, and that believing, then what? That you would have life, that you may be saved there as it was. Be very honest with me. You can show hands right now. How many of you wish the Bible was a little clearer on some things in the Scripture? You know? I think all of us would, right? And all of us would probably like to look at verse 30 and 31 here and say, boy, you know, I know what verse 30 says, but it would be nice if it did say more, right? But if we wrote everything, we'd still be wanting more, right? We'd still, and that's where our faith has to come into play right there. And it's got to grow. Absolutely. Thoughts on this? Uh-huh. Right. Even the people that lived and walked and talked with Jesus struggled, right? So it makes sense that we would struggle with those things as well. Any other comments before we close it up? The next set of appearances of Jesus will be in Galilee, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I would say next week, but it won't be next week, I guess, since we're doing the box packing, but we'll get into it eventually.